Right, what we're going to talk about in this lecture is origins, and for that we need a little bit more biochemistry and a little bit more genetics, and it gets a little bit more complicated. So if you're feeling sleepy, I suggest you shake your heads or something, go brr, 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 wake up, take a deep breath, get some oxygen flowing over there. And it's not important that you know anything about the formulas. It's not important whether you understand the genetics or anything like that. I'm going to try and bring it right down to the level where everybody will get something. So just relax, get the basic principles of it, and if you get the basic principles, that's enough. For the scientists and the medical doctors and the biochemists and what have you, please bear with me. I'm not going to go into the heavy biochemistry. That's not the point of this lecture. We could do it if we had to, but we don't want to. Right, Charles Darwin, at the time of the voyage of the Beagle, was the one who proposed that animals evolved through natural selection. He said that animals that had long necks, like this one over here, had a selective advantage over those that had shorter necks, because at the lower levels there were other animals in competition for food resources. And so he said that those with longer necks were the ones that would have the selective advantage and have a greater probability of surviving. Other people came up with different scenarios, like Lamarck, for example, who said, no, it works like this. If you want to reach the top and you really stretch your neck to get there, eventually the neck will grow. All right, that was Lamarckism. And Darwinism was far more scientific. Of course, Lamarckism, if that were true, if you flapped your arms long enough, eventually you'd fly, right? We know that Lamarckism is not true. So how did Darwinism start? And Darwin himself was not really a pushy kind of fellow. Here is Darwin. He was a quiet, sort of reserved guy. But this man over here, Huxley, became known as Darwin's bulldog. He's the one who pushed the theory, fought the battles, and broke down the barriers. Now, how did it all start? Well, it started with the voyage of the Beagle. Charles Darwin, well armed with a book written by another Charles Lyell, under his arm, was on the voyage of the Beagle. He could do this because his wife was extremely wealthy, and so he could live a life of leisure. He didn't have to work like the rest of everybody else. And then he traveled around the world, and the main idea was to draw maps of South America, and he was the naturalist. He also had a theological background, and so he went to these islands of the Galapagos, and here he saw some amazing things which made him rethink his whole philosophy. Firstly, he had Charles Lyell's books, which talked about millions of years for the geological features, so long ages were in his mind. He also knew the Bible, but the mindset of people at that time was that God had created immutable, unchangeable species. Each kind was a species, and God had created them, every single one, just like that. Now, Linnaeus was the one who drew the maps and the whole system of binomial nomenclature. 2 names for every species, like we are Homo sapiens, And so he had that idea. And if something had 3 rows of scales, it was one species, and if it had an extra row, it was another species. If something had this color, it was one species. If it had another color, it was another species. And God created, boom, 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 each one unchangeable, immutable. That was the idea. So we have millions of species on the planet. Of course, that raises the question, how do they all fit into the ark? Is that right? Okay. Now the question is, did God create immutable, unchangeable species, or did he not? When Darwin was here on the Galapagos Islands over there, he saw, amongst other things, these finches. And Darwin's finches, of course, are very famous, because finches on the Galapagos Islands have different structural features to meet different needs. So some of them have very large beaks, some of them have very small beaks, and they're very diversified. So some of them can eat little seeds, some of them insects, some of them can even use tools like this one over here, using a tool to catch termites and bugs between the bark, and some of them had strong beaks for cactus seeds and things like this. But these were finches. Now songbirds did this type of thing on the mainlands, but here on the islands it was finch. So the idea came to Darwin, now is it not probable that all these different finches were derived from a common finch ancestor, and that over time they had changed to adapt to these various food habitats and whatever they did? And so the idea grew further, and he said, well, if this is so, then God did not create, but it came through naturalistic evolution. And the idea of evolution by natural selection was born right here. Now remember, he did know nothing. He knew nothing about genetics. Nothing. Gregor Mendel had actually done his work already, his pioneering work, but it was hidden in the dust of some monastery. Nobody knew about genetics. So all he had was anatomy. Does that make sense to you? He didn't know anything about genetics. And so when he said, did God create this? He couldn't have, because they must have come from a common ancestor. He threw creation out and evolution took its place. The question he should have asked himself is, did God really create immutable, unchangeable species? Let's go into that into some detail. We know that science says life began on this planet in the early times by various gases, reducing atmospheres coming into existence around our planet. And if you pass sparks through that, you get various organic materials that you can trap. And that's how the organic matter arose on this planet. Trouble is that you would have to have all the conditions just right for those molecules to form. And they get destroyed the minute they are formed, the split second they are formed. So you have to remove them from the atmosphere. Major problem. Also, the present atmosphere, if you look down there, has oxygen in it. So it's not a reducing atmosphere, it's an oxidizing atmosphere. And those molecules for life would never be able to be formed. And if you look at the primitive Earth, as they say, what it looked like, you will see that it has water. If it has water, we know that water will be struck by cosmic rays. If there is no ozone layer, if there was no oxygen, like they say, then there was no ozone. If there was no ozone, then the water would be struck by these cosmic radiation, and it would split into oxygen and hydrogen. So if you have water, you always have oxygen. So you can never have an atmosphere like that without oxygen. So you run into major, major problems how life came into existence. If you take the amino acids in our system, in our body that we need, all living organisms need amino acids, they have nitrogen in them. Now where do they get the nitrogen from? Now they have to get it from ammonia out of the atmosphere. If you take these structures which are in our DNA, they also have nitrogen in them, but for ring structures like that to form, all the nitrogen has to be changed to hydrogen cyanide. Wow! So now you have no nitrogen up there, you have everything in cyanide form. For the amino acids, you need everything as ammonia. If you want the sugars to form, like you have in DNA, for example, you cannot get them if there is ammonia in the atmosphere. Big problem. You need totally different conditions for everything to form. So the probability of it happening is so remote as for all intents and purposes to be non-existent. To get the molecules, even if they could form, to form macromolecules, to join up, tip, 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 and to make the strings that we have in our DNA or in our proteins, the probability is infinitesimally small. It has never been demonstrated because you need enzymes to do this. So how do you get an enzyme to form if you don't have an enzyme to do what you want the enzyme to do in the first place? You get my drift?